Welcome to a quiet corner of history. Lower the lights, find a comfortable seat, and let the rain outside the window set the stage for our journey. Tonight, we do not celebrate the grand victories of the industrial age. Instead, we remember the dreamers whose inventions were destined to be forgotten by time itself. The Victorian era was a time of iron and steam, but it was also a period of wild imagination, where even the most bizarre ideas found life. Imagine a world where progress was messy, dangerous, and sometimes utterly ridiculous. These are the unusual inventions that failed to change the world as they intended. London in the late 19th century was a labyrinth of mystery, a place where the boundaries between genius and madness were often blurred by thick city smog. Inventors laboured in secret workshops, fueled by tea and ambition, sketching out devices that they believed would revolutionize the daily lives of every gentleman and lady. But for every successful steam engine, there were 100 contraptions that ended up in the scrap heap of history, leaving only these ghostly blueprints behind. Listen to the rhythm of the rain and the soft crackle of the hearth as we delve into the peculiar minds of those forgotten Victorian visionaries tonight. They sought elegance in efficiency, but often found themselves creating complexity where simplicity was needed. Their failures are just as fascinating as their grandest colonial successes. Let us explore the lighter side of history, finding humour and humanity in the gears that jammed and the boilers that refused to hiss for very long. The sound of the past is not always a roar. Sometimes it's a gentle click of a failed latch or the sigh of a cooling engine. In this stillness, we can almost hear the voices of the past, whispering their grand plans for a future that never quite arrived for their strange inventions. Take a deep breath and relax. We're going back to a time of high collars and higher expectations, where the absurd was just an experiment away. The Victorian soul was obsessed with etiquette and social standing, a drive that birthed some of the most specialized and unnecessary tools ever conceived by man. Step into the mist with me. Our first chapter explores the gadgets designed to preserve the dignity of the elite. No matter how cumbersome they might be, every problem, no matter how small, deserved a mechanical solution. Even the simple act of eating soup became a challenge for the fashionable Victorian man's beard. Reflect on the effort spent on maintaining appearances. In an age of strict social codes, a single drop of broth could ruin a gentleman's entire evening. Precision was everything, yet many of these inventors missed the mark, creating machines that were beautiful to look at but impossible to use in reality. The press heralded every new patent as a breakthrough, but the public often found these advancements more of a burden than a blessing for their daily lives. Behind those stern faces was a society terrified of impropriety, a fear that fueled a market for gadgets designed to keep everyone perfectly in their place. Time moves on, but these artifacts remain, telling a story of a world that tried too hard to be perfect and failed in the most charming ways. Let us begin with the dinner table, where the battle between etiquette and nature was fought with silver, lace, and some very peculiar metal guards. The moustache spoon was a marvel of vanity. A simple bridge of silver was all that stood between a man's pride and a damp, broth-soaked moustache. In the Victorian era, facial hair was a symbol of masculinity and status. Keeping it pristine during a multi-course meal was a task of strategic importance, patented in many forms. These spoons were essential for the fashionable man who feared the social catastrophe of a stray drop of pea soup on his lip. Rules of conduct were so rigid that even a minor spill could lead to whispers in the drawing room. The spoon was a shield against such gossip. Eventually, the fashion for giant moustaches faded, and with it, the need for these specialized spoons, leaving them as curious relics of a very hairy past. Then there was the automatic hat tipper, an invention for the man who found the physical act of greeting a lady far too exhausting for his muscles. By simply nodding or activating a small clockwork device, the hat would mechanically rise and tip, ensuring the gentleman remained perfectly polite without lifting a finger. One can only imagine the noise of grinding gears right above the inventor's ears every time he met a friend on the busy streets of London. Failure was inevitable. A gust of wind or a rusted spring could turn a polite gesture into a slapstick comedy, much to the horror of the wearer. The dream of automated politeness died quickly. It turns out that true chivalry requires a bit more human effort than a spring-loaded hat can provide. Ladies were not exempt from the burden of fashion. The crinoline, while iconic, was a structural nightmare that made the simplest movements a logistical challenge. Inventors tried to solve the problem with collapsible frames, but these often buckled at the wrong time, leading to more than a few embarrassing social moments. Social spaces were redesigned to accommodate these skirts, but the sheer inconvenience eventually led to their downfall in favour of more practical, slender Victorian silhouettes. Vanity and practicality were always at odds. The Victorian desire for the grand often overshadowed the reality of what was actually useful in a modern world. Beauty standards led to even stranger inventions, like hand-cranked facial vibrators that promised youthful skin but likely just delivered a very bad headache to the user. The pursuit of perfection knew no bounds. If a machine could shake the wrinkles away, why wouldn't one try it, regardless of how painful it seemed? These devices were loud, vibrating through the bones, and often did more harm than good, proving that science and beauty were still very uneasy bedfellows. They ended up in attics, replaced by creams and lotions that didn't require a workout just to apply, a victory for comfort over mechanical facial torture. The detachable collar was a practical idea that became a literal chokehold. Stiffened with starch to the point of being razor-sharp, it was quite dangerous, known as father killers. These collars could actually restrict blood flow if the wearer nodded off, leading to several tragic and very stiff-necked Victorian deaths. Fashion was truly a sacrifice. To look sharp, one had to risk a literal cut to the throat or a sudden loss of consciousness during a sermon. Eventually, the move towards softer fabrics saved many lives and made the Victorian gentleman a much more relaxed and arguably less lethal social figure. Time was a luxury, and so was safety. But as the Victorians moved from the parlour to the street, their inventions became even more daring and dangerous. The public sphere was a place of excitement and peril, where the desire for faster travel led to some of the most bone-shaking designs ever seen. Before the pneumatic tyre, there was the bone shaker. Its name was not a metaphor. It was a literal description of the experience of riding it. Every bump was felt directly in the spine. Riding across London was an endurance test that few were willing to take for very long at all. The lack of suspension meant that a short trip to the market could result in sore joints and a very rattled brain for the bold Victorian. If muscle power was too exhausting, why not try steam? The steam-powered bicycle was a bold idea that often ended in literal clouds of hot steam. The danger of a boiler explosion between one's legs was a significant deterrent for most. It was an invention that was simply too hot to handle. Mechanical failure on these early motorbikes usually meant a walk home, assuming you weren't scalded by the very engine meant to carry you so far. The wind was a constant enemy. Trying to stay dry with an attached umbrella often turned the bicycle into an uncontrollable sail on a stormy day. Simplicity always won in the end. A handheld umbrella and a standard bicycle were far more effective than trying to merge the two into one device. The hobby horse was the precursor to the bicycle, but without pedals, it was just a very expensive way to wear out the soles of your shoes. They looked ridiculous, and the effort required was barely less than just walking. It was a fad that faded as soon as actual pedals were invented. Innovation is often a series of awkward steps. The hobby horse was a necessary failure that paved the way for the sleek bicycles we know today. The streets of the past are littered with these abandoned ideas, each one a testament to the human desire to move faster and further than before. But the Victorians weren't just content with two wheels. They wanted to reinvent the very shape of travel itself, often with disastrously spherical results. Enter the monowheel and the dynasphere. These giant circles promised a smooth, futuristic ride. but reality was far more chaotic and much less stable. The monowheel was a sight to behold, a massive iron circle that promised the future but often delivered a tumble into the dusty London streets. Balancing was the primary issue. Without the stability of a second wheel, the slightest tilt could send the entire machine and its pilot crashing down. The mechanical complexity required to keep the driver upright inside a spinning wheel was immense, and the technology of the time was simply not ready. Then there was the problem of jabilling. If you brake too hard, the driver would simply spin around the inside of the wheel in a circle. It was less a mode of transport and more a circus act. Dignity was often the first casualty of this particular Victorian quest for rapid individual movement. The monowheel remains one of the most iconic failures of the age, a beautiful dream of geometry that failed to account for the laws of physics. If wheels weren't enough, why not use the power of the wind? The sailing bicycle was a hybrid that promised effortless travel on windy days. The problem, of course, was that the wind rarely blows in exactly the direction you want to go. Turning a corner often resulted in a disaster. Urban environments with their narrow streets and low-hanging signs were not built for bicycles with sails. It was an invention better suited for an empty desert. Nature has a way of humbling even the most clever inventors. A simple rainstorm could turn a high-tech sailing bike into a sodden, heavy mess of cloth. Eventually, the sail was abandoned, and the bicycle returned to being a land-based vehicle, free from the unpredictable whims of the gusts and gales of London. Even leisure was subject to the steam craze. The steam-powered pogo stick was a device that promised to make every jump a monumental, explosive event. The height was impressive, but the landings were brutal. The lack of control meant that every leap was a gamble with your own ankles and dignity. It was a toy designed for the truly fearless, or perhaps the truly foolish. Steam and jumping proved to be a recipe for many broken springs. Children's toys in the Victorian era were often surprisingly dangerous, reflecting a society that valued excitement and progress over the modern concept of safety first. For those who didn't want to jump or sail, there were mechanical walking shoes. These boots promised to increase your stride with the help of internal springs. The shoes had a mind of their own. Instead of a smooth walk, users often found themselves in a frantic run just to stay upright and moving. Reliability was non-existent. A snapped spring could leave you with one normal foot and one superpowered foot, making for a very lopsided journey home. Like so many other personal transport ideas, they were eventually recognised as more of a hazard than a help, and were quietly retired from the streets. The desire to conquer the water led to water walking suits. These inflatable boots were supposed to allow a man to stroll across the Thames with ease. Gravity is much harder to fight on water. Most testers ended up upside down, their feet floating high while they struggled to keep their heads above water. The suits were cumbersome and easily damaged. One small hole meant a very quick and very cold bath, ending the dream of walking on the waves. Even the depths were not safe from inventors. The submarine bicycle was an ambitious attempt to explore the riverbed with nothing but leg power and hope. The physical effort required to move through water was vastly underestimated. Most riders barely moved a few inches before becoming hopelessly bogged down in the silt. Safety was precarious at best. Relying on a long air hose and a set of bicycle pedals in the dark depths was a risk few were truly willing to take. They remain as monuments to a time when humans were desperate to explore every environment, no matter how ill-equipped they were for the actual physical journey. Large-scale inventions like steamships changed the world, but these small, personal failures remind us of the individual effort that goes into every new era. In an age of rapid change, it was easy to lose one's direction. For every compass that pointed the way, there were a dozen gadgets that led nowhere. The inventor's life was one of constant struggle against the limits of materials and the harsh reality of physical laws that refused to bend to their will. They were the brave souls who took the first, clumsy steps so that we could eventually run. Their failures are the foundation of our modern, functional world. Every screw and gear told a story of ambition. Even the projects that fell apart taught the world something valuable about what not to do next time. As the moon rises, we leave the streets behind and enter the shadowed world of the Victorian home, where health and home were equally fraught with gadgets. Welcome to the world of Victorian wellness, where the fear of disease was met with a wave of inventions that were often more dangerous than the illness. Electricity was the new magic. People believed it could cure anything from a simple headache to the most deep-seated melancholy of the Victorian soul. The electropathic belt was a bestseller. It promised to invigorate the body with constant electrical shocks, provided you didn't mind the smell of ozone and burnt skin. In reality, these belts mostly delivered a mild irritation, but the placebo effect was strong in an age desperate for any scientific-sounding miracle cure available. Science and superstition were often intertwined. The line between a genuine medical breakthrough and a clever piece of showmanship was very thin indeed. Step into the realm of Victorian medicine, where fear of the unknown led to gadgets that promised eternal health through the strange power of electric belts. They saw the human body as a machine that just needed the right current to keep running. It was a charmingly simple view of very complex biology. These batteries were the powerhouses of the Victorian clinic, providing the spark of life to patients who were often just suffering from poor city air. The sensation was described as bracing, but to us, it looks more like a form of mild torture disguised as a cutting-edge medical treatment. When the shocks failed to cure the fever, the belts were cast aside, leaving only the scars of a society that trusted too much in the spark. Then there was the ultimate fear, being buried alive. The safety coffin was an invention born from a widespread Victorian obsession with premature burial. If you woke up 6 feet under, you simply had to pull a cord, and the bell above ground would ring, alerting the cemetery watchman to help. It provided peace of mind to the living, though there is no record of a bell ever actually saving someone from a premature subterranean fate. False alarms were common, caused by the wind or the settling of the earth, leading to many a terrified night for the poor graveyard guards. Death was a grand production in Victorian times. These safety devices were just another part of the elaborate theatre of mourning and the fear of the end. Today, they are reminders of a time when the boundary between life and death was felt much more acutely and much more mechanically than it is now. The air of London was a slow killer. Respirators were common, but many were so heavy and restrictive that they made breathing even harder than the fog. They were the steampunk gas masks of their day, a necessary but uncomfortable accessory for the city dweller who wanted to keep their lungs relatively clean. The sheer amount of coal smoke meant that even the best filters were useless after a short walk, proving that the city's problems were bigger than any gadget. Every sense was under assault. Even the eyes needed mechanical cleaning from the constant rain of soot and ash that fell over the Victorian metropolis. It was a time of obsession with hygiene, as the burgeoning middle class tried to separate themselves from the grime and disease of the lower city streets. Medicine was moving towards science, but it still held onto the dramatic. These tools were the first steps in a long journey toward real, effective healing. Not all medicines were what they seemed. Many were laced with opium or alcohol, making the cure much more addictive and dangerous than the original complaint. The Victorian era was high on its own inventions, sometimes literally. It was a society trying to manage its own anxieties with a cabinet full of poisons. Even children were subjects of these experiments. These teething devices were often made of materials we now know to be toxic or physically dangerous to infants. The nursery was a place of innocence and hidden dangers, where every new scientific parenting gadget was welcomed by parents who just wanted the best. Some ideas, like the automatic baby washer, were thankfully never put into mass production. Some things simply should not be mechanized for the sake of humanity. It remains a bizarre footnote in history, a reminder that the industrial mindset occasionally forgot that humans are not just biological machines to be processed. In the end, it was the human touch that mattered most, a lesson that many Victorian inventors learned only after their grand machines had failed to deliver. The light fades on the medical miracles of the past, leaving us to wonder what modern gadgets we use today will seem just as absurd tomorrow. Life goes on, measured and protected by better tools now, but with the same spirit of curiosity and fear that drove our Victorian ancestors to invent. The doctor's rounds are over. Now, we return to the warmth of the home, where the domestic sphere was being transformed by the power of steam. The home was a sanctuary, but it was also a testing ground for the latest household conveniences, some of which were more like domestic nightmares. Steam was the blood of the age. People wanted to harness it for everything, from heating their tea to rocking their babies to sleep at night. Comfort was the goal, but the path to achieving it was often paved with overly complicated and slightly terrifying mechanical contraptions that rarely worked for very long. Let us explore the conveniences that the Victorian housewife was told she couldn't live without, even if they occasionally threatened to destroy the entire house. Even the act of serving dinner was being revolutionized by technology, or at least, that was the grand promise of the ambitious Victorian inventor class. The pneumatic dinner tube was a dream of instant service. Why wait for a servant when you could have your mutton delivered by a blast of air? The problem was control. Food is not meant to travel at the speed of sound through brass pipes. As many a soup-covered Victorian guest quickly discovered, cleaning the system was a disaster. One stuck potato could ruin a whole week of meals, proving that human hands were still the best way to serve. Sometimes, the old ways are the best. The pneumatic tube remains a funny reminder of how far we tried to push technology into our most intimate spaces. Cleaning was a constant chore. The self-cleaning window was a great idea that mostly just resulted in scratched glass and a lot of loud, annoying mechanical noise. It was faster to just use a cloth and a bucket. The complexity of the machine far outweighed the simple task it was designed to solve for homeowners. Imagine a cradle that rocks itself using the raw power of steam, a mechanical marvel that risked turning a peaceful nap into a high-pressure kitchen experiment. The idea of leaving a baby near a pressurized boiler is something that would terrify a modern parent, but for the Victorian, it was the peak of convenience. Instead of a gentle sway, the steam cradle often provided a jerky, mechanical shake that was more likely to cause seasickness than a peaceful sleep. Domestic life and heavy machinery are rarely a good mix. The steam cradle was quickly abandoned in favour of the much safer, much quieter human hand. For the lazy reader, there was the mechanical page-turner, a device that promised to take the immense effort out of reading your favourite Dickens novel. It was more of a page-destroyer than a turner. Its metal fingers were far too clumsy for the delicate paper of the 19th century publishing world. It is a classic example of an invention looking for a problem that didn't exist. Turning a page is, after all, not a particularly strenuous activity. The Victorian city smelled terrible. The odour-filtering hat was a personal attempt to create a private, fresh-smelling bubble for the sophisticated man on the move. It worked for a few minutes, but charcoal can only do so much against the combined power of horse manure and coal fires of a giant city. Another fashion disaster waiting to happen. The quest for cleanliness often ended in a mess that was far worse than the original problem being solved. Before the vacuum cleaner, we had mechanical beaters. They were loud, dusty, and required more physical effort than just hitting the carpet with a stick. The dust didn't go anywhere. It just moved from the carpet into the air and the lungs of the poor person operating the machine that day. Victorians even tried voice control. These lamps were supposed to extinguish when you shouted at them, but they often went out if anyone just sneezed, a humorous failure of early automation. It turns out that a simple knob or a match was far more reliable than a temperamental, sound-sensitive lamp. The mechanical flycatcher was a masterpiece of over-engineering. Why swat a fly when you can build a clockwork monster to do it for you slowly? The flies were always faster than the gears. It was a rhythmic, clicking failure that served as more of a conversation piece than an actual pest control. Beauty was a fire hazard. Self-heating curling irons were convenient until they leaked, turning a session of hairstyling into a sudden and terrifying kitchen fire. The things people did for fashion, to have the perfect curls, one had to risk their very scalp to the unpredictable heat of these early devices. They were eventually replaced by electric versions, but the scorched handles of the past remain as evidence of the bravery of the Victorian woman at home. Communication was key. The telegraphed dinner system was a complex array of bells meant to replace the simple act of a lady calling for tea. If the wires crossed, you might get a bowl of cold water instead of a hot steak. It was a system prone to errors and very loud noises. The more complex the system, the more likely it was to fail. The Victorian home was often a graveyard of wires and bells that no one used. The mechanical butler was for the man who truly hated to stand up. It was a Rube Goldberg machine for the sake of an afternoon sherry. It was never as smooth as a human hand. The rails were ugly, and the risk of a spilled drink was far higher than anyone was willing to accept. Human effort is often the most efficient tool we have. These inventions tried to replace the person, but they only succeeded in making life more difficult. Even a bath was a science. This giant thermometer ensured your water was exactly 80 degrees, assuming you didn't mind sharing the tub with a giant plank. Most people just use their toes. It turns out the human body is a much better sensor for comfort than a giant piece of Victorian mahogany and glass. Dental hygiene was not spared. The hand-cranked toothbrush was a terrifying device that promised clean teeth, but likely just caused a lot of bleeding gums. Control was non-existent. One wrong move and you'd be polishing your tonsils instead of your teeth. A lesson in the dangers of over-automating personal care. It was another idea ahead of its time, waiting for the gentle power of electricity and the wisdom of better, softer materials for the human touch. The shoe shiner was a staple of the upper-class home, but it often ate more shoelaces than it polished leather, making it a very expensive household nuisance. Mechanical power is indiscriminate. It doesn't know the difference between a scuff on a heel and a silk lace, much to the dismay of the fashionable. Eventually, the human shoeshine boy remained the standard of excellence, proving that some jobs simply require the attention and care of a living person. Writing was an art. This pen promised to guide the hand, but its weight made it feel like writing with a lead pipe, exhausting the user quickly. It was a noble attempt to help, but like so many Victorian gadgets, it failed to account for the actual physical comfort of the human being using it. Simplicity is often the ultimate sophistication. The feather quill, used for centuries, proved to be far superior to the over-engineered metal pens of the new age. The home was a place of comfort, but the world outside was still full of perceived dangers that needed their own set of very strange Victorian solutions. The Victorian streets were perceived as perilous, leading to the fire escape hat, a piece of fashion that doubled as a desperate rope ladder for survival. The idea was that if a fire broke out, you could simply hook the rope to a window and slide down to safety using only your headgear. Physics, unfortunately, had other plans. A hat is not a harness, and the results of trying to use one as such were often painful and very fast. It was a peak example of Victorian safety inventions, highly imaginative, visually impressive, and completely useless in an actual emergency situation during the night. Crime was a major fear. The anti-garroting collar was designed to prevent strangulation by turning the wearer's neck into a literal, spiked death trap for attackers. The problem was that the spikes were just as dangerous to the wearer as they were to a potential thief, making every turn of the head a hazard. Safety and style were in constant conflict. To be safe, one had to live in a state of constant self-inflicted discomfort and occasional puncture wounds to the neck. Paranoia birthed the rear-view umbrella. It allowed the suspicious Victorian to watch their back while keeping their head forward, avoiding the danger of eye contact. The mirror was usually too small to see anything clearly, and the constant shaking made the image a blurred mess of street shadows and moving shapes. Another safety device that proved to be more of a distraction, leading to more accidents than it ever prevented on the chaotic roads of old London. The sword umbrella was a real-life spy gadget. It gave the Victorian gentleman a secret edge in a fight, provided he could remember which way to open it. The mechanism was often temperamental. In the moment of need, You might find yourself with a blade when you really just needed a dry place to hide. Maintenance was high for these hidden weapons. Without constant care, they became fused with their own disguises, becoming heavier and less useful than a standard cane. Bulletproof technology was in its infancy. These early steel vests were so heavy that they made walking a chore and sitting down almost completely impossible for the user. Protection came at the cost of mobility. One was safe from a bullet, but likely to die of exhaustion or heat stroke before ever reaching their destination safely. It was effective in tests, but the weight of several pounds of iron on one's torso was enough to discourage all but the most truly terrified individuals. Fear of the dark alleyways led to the mechanical dog barker, a pocket-sized device designed to trick thieves into thinking you had a giant, invisible protector with you. It was less intimidating hound and more broken toy. The sound was easily recognized as fake, and the social embarrassment was far more real than the safety. Deception only works if it's believable. The mechanical barker was a charmingly naive attempt to weaponize sound in an age of very real street threats. Fire was the great urban enemy. These glass fire grenades were supposed to be the modern way to fight a blaze before it could spread too far. They were often filled with toxic chemicals that were worse than the smoke itself. Breaking one in a small room was a recipe for a medical emergency. They were beautiful, but ineffective. Today, they are highly sought-after antiques, prized for their aesthetics rather than their ability to actually put out a single flame. For the heavy sleeper, there was the alarm bed, a brutal way to start the day, ensuring you were awake and possibly injured before the sun was even up. It was effective, but at what cost to the human spirit? Waking up shouldn't feel like a physical assault, even in a society obsessed with early productivity. It was a gadget for a world that didn't yet understand the value of a gentle wake-up call, preferring the harsh hand of mechanical discipline instead. To keep cool and keep flies away, the peacock fan system was the height of luxury. It was an elaborate, moving centerpiece that often distracted from the meal. One wrong adjustment of the weights and you'd have a mini hurricane in the middle of your dinner party, a disaster for any carefully curated Victorian social evening. The fans were elegant but impractical. They were eventually replaced by simpler, manual fans or the far more reliable electric ceiling fans we use today. Preserving the voice was the new frontier. These early recorders were wonders of science, but their quality was so poor they sounded like ghosts whispering from a cave. It was a labour of love to capture just a few seconds of sound. These cylinders were fragile and easily lost their information if kept in a warm room. The fragility of the past is evident in these artifacts. They were the first attempts to capture the ephemeral, even if they often failed to keep it for long. The adventurer's cane was a toolkit for the street. It was heavy, awkward, and usually had a compass that didn't work and a telescope that was too small. Multi-tools of the Victorian era were often masters of none. They tried to be everything at once and ended up being nothing but a heavy burden to carry. Form followed function, but for the Victorian, form often tried to swallow function whole. A cane that can't support weight is just a very long, useless box. They remain as a collection of curiosities, a testament to an age that felt a little too vulnerable and tried to fix it with a lot of brass. The city has moved on, its dangers and its strange solutions replaced by a different world. But the spirit of those inventors still haunts these ancient, foggy streets. Even portability was a relative term. This portable desk was a logistical nightmare for anyone who actually wanted to write something while they were travelling. It was a world of beautiful, heavy, and often completely impractical things. A time when doing it the hard way was frequently disguised as the new, modern way. We smile at these follies, but they are the stepping stones of progress. The dreamers have long passed, leaving behind their ambitious, albeit flawed, mechanical ghosts. Every failed invention was a lesson learned, a small piece of data that helped future generations refine their ideas and build things that actually worked for everyone. The motion stops, but the story continues. We are the beneficiaries of their mistakes, living in a world they could only dream of in their small workshops. Look how far we have come. The chaos of the steam age has been smoothed over by the precision of the digital, but the curiosity remains exactly the same. Would the Victorian inventor recognise our world? They would likely be amazed by the efficiency, and perhaps a little disappointed by the lack of visible, beautiful brass gears. Their failures still inspire. They teach us that it is okay to try and fail, because even the most ridiculous idea can be a spark for something truly great. To those forgotten inventors, we owe a debt of gratitude for their bravery and their boundless, if sometimes misguided, imagination that helped shape the world today. History is not just a list of successes, it is a messy, beautiful collection of every dream ever dreamt, no matter how many of them actually came true. The night is deep now. The stories of the past are settled, tucked away into the shadows of the library where they can rest for another 100 years. Sleep well, knowing that even the most unusual parts of ourselves are just another kind of experiment in the grand, ongoing invention of a human life. The spirits of the Victorian age are at peace, their machines are silent, and their dreams are now just a part of the quiet air we breathe. Close your eyes and let the history drift away. There are no more gears to turn tonight, and no more boilers to keep under high-pressure watch. The world is at rest. The failures of the past are forgotten in the dreams of the future, where anything is possible and everything is just an idea away. Good night, dear dreamer. May your rest be as deep as a Victorian library, and your dreams be as bright as a first edition blueprint of a better world. The story ends here. Peace be with you as you drift into a quiet sleep, surrounded by the gentle echoes of a very unusual and fascinating history.